Hey everybody! Today on Classic Mini DIY, we're going to replace a clutch without taking the motor out of the car. Alright everyone, welcome to Classic Mini DIY, the next episode technically of Operation Bad Wolf, but this is going to be an in-depth how-to on how to remove the clutch out of your car without actually removing the motor. Now this is a video that has been requested a bunch of times from you guys. And to be honest with you, I haven't wanted to do it because one, I didn't need to replace my clutch, and two, the job is really kind of frustrating to do, time consuming, and to be honest, if you're not replacing your clutch like I didn't have to, it was not really a job that I kind of wanted to do. So now that I have to, now that I have an opportunity, I'm going to show you guys the whole process. But as you guys can see, I have 3 different clutches on the table behind me here. I'm actually sitting down right now because I wanted to make sure you guys could see this. Each one of these clutches is for a different kind of car. And a huge shout out to 7 Mini Parts for sending these over to me. They sent these to me. I obviously don't have a later car, so these were not necessary, but they wanted to make sure that you guys could see all the different kinds of clutches there were. And then I also have some really cool stuff that came directly from their shop I want to show you guys a little bit later in the episode. But to get started, we have 3 different kinds of clutches here. Now, these 2 on the left side, these are your Verto clutches. One of them is a 180 millimeter and one is 190. And the 190 millimeter goes on your MPI minis. Those are the latest model minis. Those are the ones that came out right towards the end of the production line. And it had a slightly larger clutch disc. The SPI and carbureted motors using a Verto clutch had a 180 millimeter clutch, which I'll show you guys here. Otherwise, they are the same mechanism. There's nothing different from them aside from that size of the actual clutch disc, which you can see here. This is the one that came off of my car. And then finally over here, this is your Pre-Verto clutch. It has a diaphragm and a clutch disc and the pressure plate. Everything's all disassembled and separate. You'll see this in more detail a little bit later in the episode. Once it's pulled out of the car, it becomes a little bit more clear. Now, there are 2 different kinds of Pre-Verto clutches. There is one that was made specifically for the 850 to 1100 cc motors. That was a slightly less strong, less aggressive diaphragm system, and that was just for the lower displacement motors. And then the 1275 motors, they actually got a stronger diaphragm so that it could accommodate the extra power from the motor. Now, let me pull the camera over here. We're going to go ahead and open up these boxes and I'll show you exactly the differences between the 2 so you guys know what you're looking for on your Mini. Now to get started, let's open up the box that has the clutch that came out of my car in it, and this is going to be the replacement that I'm going to be putting into my car. Now they sell the Borg & Beck branded clutch system. This is a really high quality company, so if you know you need a clutch, you're going to get a good quality clutch from 7 Mini. And what this kit's going to include is one, a clutch disc, and this disc it's very important that you don't get this oily or anything like that. This needs to be able to actually grab and bite into the pressure plate and the flywheel. So if this has oil on it, it's not going to do that. It's going to compromise the clutch and it's not going to function. So it's super important that we keep this in its bag until we're ready to put this on the car. And now moving into the bottom half of this box here, it also comes with a few different things. It comes with a spline, clutch spline grease. This is to go on the splines on the clutch disc when you slide it on, as well as I like to put a little bit on where the release bearing goes on. I'll show you that when we put this in, but it does come with a brand new gray diaphragm. This one is made for a 1275 motor, a higher displacement motor. And then the last thing it comes with here is a release bearing. Now, this clutch release bearing that comes with it is a solid, good clutch release bearing. It's not a heavy duty one, but it's solid, but it will also come with a clip. These are used to clip this in. There's 2 different kinds of Pre-Verto clutch release bearings. In my case, mine's just a press on, but there are some that are held on with this little clip here, but mine is not one that uses that, so I'm not going to be able to show you how that clips on, but it does come with that if you need it. Now, at this point, you have everything that you really need to put your clutch together if you are doing just a quick clutch replacement. Now, while that is a good kit, and this comes with everything you need, there are a few things that I would recommend getting in addition to this for this whole job. It doesn't come with that kit, but I do think it's very important to get. One, you're gonna need one of these cool fancy little washers that go on the end of your flywheel bolt. And this is your flywheel bolt. It's the big bolt that holds the whole flywheel on. This washer simply slides over this flywheel bolt, and obviously this will get all pushed up these tabs when you're tightening your flywheel down. However, these things get mangled up when you're taking it off. It's just kind of the nature of it, and once they've been bent, I personally think it's totally worth it to just get a new one. They're really not expensive, so it's kind of a no-brainer to me. You can also get new flywheel bolts. They do carry 7 Mini Parts does carry a version from Swift-Tune. It's a really nice flywheel bolt, and it's a little bit more expensive, but it's a super high quality part. So that is something that you might want to consider getting. Additionally, you're gonna wanna get some new bolts. These are heavy duty bolts, and these are used for holding your clutch straps on. Again, I will show you this stuff going on the car when we get to it, but these are totally worth buying if you have a Pre-Verto clutch. They are just high quality bolts, and there's really not much more to be said about it. High quality bolts are high quality bolts. Next, you'll have a small flywheel key. This is a special piece of metal that fits into the flywheel and keeps it from spinning on the actual crankshaft. This should come off of your car. If it's all mangled, go ahead and pick up a new one, since the whole flywheel is going to be off your car anyway. Finally, they do sell a heavy-duty clutch release bearing, and this is something that I think is totally worth getting. It's something that will add strength to your clutch release system, and getting a heavy-duty one, it doesn't hurt you in any way. The only thing it does is really it benefits you. This allows you the peace of mind knowing your release bearing isn't going to fail or create a whole bunch of unwanted noise. I do have a video about how to replace that release bearing that should be popping up in the corner, but if you have your whole clutch out like this video, it's a good time to replace it with a heavy duty one. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention here are the clutch straps. Now, these straps connect this big old diaphragm here to the actual pressure plate. They go underneath the diaphragm, and they connect to it. I'll show you guys when I put mine back on. But a standard car uses 6 and a high performance car uses 9. If you put too many on there, on a car that's not made for it, it's not going to work right. So just keep that in mind. You are going to want to stick with the recommended amount of straps for your car. Most likely that's going to be 6 straps, 2 per hole. And with that, that is the whole clutch parts list that I would recommend. This is going to cover the majority of the things that you would need to replace on your clutch and your clutch system if you have a Pre-Verto system. But like I said, I do have 2 other clutches here. I'm only going to open up one of these, since the only difference is the clutch disc is a little bit bigger on the MPI model. But this is a Verto clutch system. And so like 2 of these parts are something that you would use on this Pre-Verto system, but the majority are not necessary like the Verto system is. Now, one thing that's a little bit different that you'll notice right off the bat is this is a sprung clutch, whereas my Pre-Verto one is a fixed clutch. And what that means is these springs right here allow the clutch to kind of flex a little bit. I can barely flex it by hand, but what happens is as the clutch is re-engaging with the motor, this allows it to have a little bit of a buffer so that when you're shifting your gears, it's not quite as like aggressive as it pops down into gear. It's a great thing to have if it's a road car or a general use like everyday car. It's going to make shifting a little less aggressive. That said, with the fixed disc, it's really not that bad. I drive my Mini all the time, and I've always had a fixed disc. To my knowledge, you can't actually take one of these sprung discs and use it in a Pre-Verto system, but correct me if I'm wrong, internet people. Now, I'll set this off to the side as well, and now we will get down to the nitty-gritty of what makes this different. So, as you can see here, we have a full clutch assembly. This is all put together, and right here is your release bearing for this. This goes on your plunger so that this actually allows you to release and deploy the clutch. And then instead of having this big diaphragm here, you actually have this coil. Well, it's not even really coils. It's like these finned spring system, and this gets pressed, and that's what engages and disengages your clutch. Now with this system, it's a little bit different. You have your pressure plate right here with all of your spring assembly and everything, and this is the face that your clutch rubs up against, and then the other side is your flywheel. So you have your clutch in here, like so, if I remember correctly, and as your motor's turning, your clutch isn't engaged. What is happening is this is spinning as well as the flywheel that's on the other side. And then when you press the clutch in, it releases the pressure and allows the clutch to spin inside in between the pressure plate and your flywheel. And that's what allows you to shift gears, and it disengages the power from the wheels. That's really the whole purpose of the clutch. And the other system that we have, the Pre-Verto system, operates on the same principle. However, the pressure plate is a separate piece, and it doesn't actually get all put on in one piece like this one does. So this would all slide on right over the flywheel, and then you would tighten it down on these holes right up here using the bolts that are provided in the kit, as you can see here. These are the kit provided bolts, and then you would reassemble the front side of your clutch housing. Now, for those of you who weren't aware that there were different kinds of clutches on the Mini, you might be wondering, why are there different kinds of clutches on the Mini? Well, this one is a more modernized clutch, this Verto system, but keep in mind that newer is not necessarily always better. This is easier to maintain, it's easier to fix and operate, and the benefit of this is that every time you replace your clutch, you're getting a new pressure plate system. Whereas on the Pre-Verto system, when you are replacing your clutch, all you're getting is a new diaphragm. The actual pressure plate and flywheel stay the same. So if there's wear on either of those parts, you're gonna start running into problems even when you replace your clutch. And I'm gonna get into that a little bit later, because my flywheel and pressure plate had a considerable amount of wear on it, and I sent it off to 7 Mini Parts to have it fixed. So most people, especially people who have high power cars or like to race their minis, will opt for the Pre-Verto system. This provides them with a stronger system, a system that's easier to lighten up, say put a lighter flywheel or a lighter pressure plate on, and overall it's better for high power applications. Now this clutch system isn't necessarily bad for high power applications, it's simply just not as good as the Pre-Verto system. But these ones are much more prevalent. These ones are also easier to find replacement parts for. Unfortunately, Pre-Verto flywheels and pressure plates are getting harder and harder to find if you want to stick with a stock system. They're really easy to find if you want to get a lightened flywheel or a lightened pressure plate, because most race companies, MED Engineering, places like that, carry lightened versions of these components. Looking at longevity, you might be better off with a Verto system if you don't plan to put crazy power out your motor. So the last thing I'm going to mention about these clutch discs and clutch everything that I'm talking about here is a reminder. There are technically 4 different types of clutches that you can get for your car. You need to figure out what type of clutch you have, and then you can order the correct part for yourself. First, you'll want to figure out, is it a Pre-Verto system or is it a Verto system? And that can be found very easily by looking on the outside of your clutch housing. And if you have a Pre-Verto system, you'll have a super long actuation arm that sits down into that plunger right here. And then if you have a Verto system, this is going to be about 1/4 of the size. It's going to stick out right here, and that is a Verto system. So once you've figured out which type of clutch you have, the next is to figure out which type of that clutch you will need. So if you have a Pre-Verto system, an 850 to 1100 size motor will take a specific kind of diaphragm, which can be found at 7 Mini Parts. And keep in mind, the links to all this stuff are in the description below. If you need any of these parts for your Mini, if you use those links, I get small kickbacks that help me fund projects like this to show you guys this stuff. And then if you have a 1275 motor, they'll have a kit for that. And then over here, the 180mm clutch disc is for an SPI Mini or a Carb Mini, the later Minis. And then a 190 size clutch disc is for the MPI Minis. So that covers kind of all this stuff, all the different clutch talk. I know it was probably a lot. So if you have any questions, post them in the comment section, please. I'm happy to answer these questions for you. But with that, let's dive into the next step. Obviously my clutch is already out of my car. I've showed you a lot of those parts, but let's dive out there and I'll show you guys how to remove it from your car. And then I can show you some of the other cool stuff that 7 Mini Parts is doing for me on this project. All right, so now that you have a pretty good idea of all of the different kinds of clutches that were in this car, now we're looking at the actual clutch housing, as well as all the kind of ancillary stuff that's on my car. There's a little bit of difference here that you guys might notice if you have a keen eye. However, the majority of the stuff here is pretty similar to any other car that you'd have. Now, as I mentioned before, my car is a Pre-Verto system, and what that means is that this slave cylinder right here is set up higher, and this beam right here, this actuating arm, is much longer. On a Verto clutch, you have your slave cylinder, which is pretty much the same, positioned kind of like on its side here on the front of this cover, and you have a much shorter arm. And on one hand, that is a lot better because you have less of a wear distance, so this has less of an ability to really fatigue inside your car and cause extra play in your clutch. However, the drawback is that you have a Verto clutch inside this housing, and that's a little less strong in comparison to a Pre-Verto system like I have here. Now, in order to get down to the clutch and everything, we got to take off some of this extra stuff. So in my case, I've got a special breather system that I've hosed up. I've not really gone over that yet, and I do plan on talking about that in one of my kind of odds and ends videos that's coming up soon. But for right now, I'm going to take this apart. I'm going to take the breather off, and I'm also going to remove this ignition coil because it's just going to make my life a little easier getting down and getting access to everything down here. Once we do that, we will move on to the next step, which is getting the kind of clutch, actually starting to disassemble that. So give me 2 minutes here, get this catch can off, and we'll be off to the races. All right, and so now, as you can see, we've cleaned this up a little bit. Now I have access to the slave cylinder much easier, as well as the walk itself, the whole mounting system up here on the front. Now, this is the hardest part, getting this walk cover off of the whole flywheel system. There are other hard parts, but in my opinion, that is actually the hardest part of this job. But to start this off, we have to remove the slave cylinder. Now, the slave cylinder is only held on by the spring here and then 2 bolts. It's extremely similar, if not completely identical, if I remember correctly, on a Verto system. So simply take some needle nose pliers, unhook the spring here, and then we are going to unbolt these 9/16 bolts off and take that slave cylinder and just set it off to the side. We don't actually have to disconnect it completely unless you have a hard line, in which case the hard line probably will need to get disconnected and you'll have to rebleed this system. Now, one thing, if you can't get to the bolt that's on the back of the slave cylinder, which you probably won't be able to, not easily at least, you can actually take this arm out before you start doing that. You can pull this pin out, which often and should have a cotter pin passing through the other side of it to keep it from coming out. In my case, mine doesn't, but that is because I have been testing this. It hasn't been put together completely yet. But once you pull that pin out, you can see there's a hole right down in there that actually allows you to pass that cotter pin through. You're gonna set that off to the side, and this arm should just kind of fall out there. It's not really held on in any other way. You have your actuating point down on the bottom, and then you have this clevis pin on the top that runs into your slave cylinder. And now you can actually get access to the bolt that's on the back of that slave cylinder. Now, with the slave cylinder, you can actually just take this off and set it over to the side. As you can see, I've got a bendy line here, but if you have a hard line, this is where you would have to disconnect the slave cylinder on the bottom side of it here. Once you start putting everything back together, you're gonna have to rebleed the system via the bleed nipple on the back of the slave cylinder here. This bleeding process is pretty much identical to the way that you bleed the brakes. You, in fact, can actually use that easy bleed system. I've got a video on how to use that popping up here. You can use that on the master cylinder here. But setting that off to the side. Now it's time for the hard part. So what I'm talking about when I refer to the hard part is getting this clutch cover, or the walk that it is sometimes affectionately called, this needs to be taken off. But in order to do that, you actually have to get down and disconnect the engine mount. And additionally, you're gonna have to get to these bolts right here, which should be 1/2 inch. Sometimes they are 7/16 used on here, but you'll have to get to the bolts that are on the underside of this walk. It is a pain in the butt. But first things first, let's disconnect the engine mount down there, and then what we're gonna do is lift the motor up just a tiny little hair to lift the weight off of the actual engine mount so that this walk can come up and off up the top here. Now, we also might need to disconnect our starter. I'm gonna try and do this without disconnecting the starter, but sometimes it extends down into this space here and will prevent you from getting the cover off all the way. So hopefully I don't have to do that. I really don't want to, but we shall see. First things first though, let's get under the car. Now, as I mentioned before, you're gonna need to remove the 2 bolts here that hold the engine mount on, one of the bottom engine mounts. This one is the bottom right engine mount. And in order to do that, these 2 bolts just need to get pulled out. Now, in the event that you have an original engine mount on your car, this might be a little bit more difficult because these bolts might actually be run into a set of nuts. Now, in my case, I have some captive nuts on my engine mount, and what that means is that the nuts themselves don't actually come off. But if you have an older engine mount, this part might be a little bit harder. You will simply have to reach in from the front of the car to hold those nuts and loosen these bolts here. So this part might actually be a good job for 2 people if you don't think you have long enough arms to do that. All right, and with those removed, the next step is to support the bottom of the motor and ever so slightly lift it up off of the ground. So I'll show you how to do that here, and then from there we'll have to remove the bolts on the walk. Now for that process, I'm going to show you from the top of the car, but you will need to get the ones on the bottom of the walk, and you'll have to do that from the base and the bottom of the car here. It's pretty difficult, so just want to give you a fair warning on that one. All right, so all of those bolts are out, and honestly, it was not as bad as I remember it being. However, I did do one thing that really helped me out, and it was bending a wrench. This wrench allowed me to get in the bottom there and actually turn these bolts out. And then finally, there's one bolt, not this one right here, but one more down. That is the hardest bolt to get out, hands down. And I will tell you this, and I'm sure I'm gonna get a lot of flack for saying this, but every time I've done this job, when I've done this in the car like this, I have not put that bolt back in. I just don't do it. It's damn near impossible, and I'm sure it is possible because it came out. It's just a matter of getting your big, stupid, meaty fingers in there and getting it tightened down. So I am gonna try it when I put this all back together, but I will say I've always left one bolt off of these walk covers once I put it back on like that. But that's just my 2 cents. I'm not encouraging you to do that specifically, but just, know that I have been running this car for almost 10 years now and it hasn't been a problem. So now this walk cover should come off unless it can't get past that starter, which I'm thinking is probably going to be the case. I'm going to disconnect the top 2 bolts that connect the engine steady on here. I think I might be able to. Nah, I'm just going to disconnect the starter and make my life a little bit easier. So 9/16 bolt on the starter here. There's one on the top and the bottom. We should be able to just kind of push this off to the side, and then we'll be able to really get in there and pull this walk out. All right, and so with that, the walk is off, as you can see. Torn my glove. Now, I did unbolt these because I needed this to move a little bit more, because good Lord, that didn't want to come off. Although, it didn't really matter because there's another bolt down there, so whatever. It's off now. So now we have a good look at our clutch diaphragm, as well as our whole clutch system, flywheel, all that. So now we can start taking that apart. Additionally, You can see the clutch release bearing here as well. So let's set this off to the side, and we now will need to start disassembling our clutch and flywheel. All right, so now we are into the clutch itself and the whole flywheel system right here. And what you can see here is on my Pre-Verto system, this is my clutch diaphragm. This is what gets pressed in and allows the clutch to disengage and removes the transfer of power from obviously the crankshaft inside the motor to the flywheel and thus the primary gear. So right now there are 3 strap bolts, 1, 2, 3 down at the bottom, and we need to take those off. So let's do that. Now when doing this job, I strongly recommend replacing these bolts. They're not expensive. You can get them from 7 Mini Parts, and they're a really nice thing to replace when you're working on this. All right, and with that, the clutch diaphragm should come off here, and we've got a good look at it now. This is one of the pieces that wears, and this is something that does come in the kit to replace. So I'll dive into that more when we get down there to replace it. All right, so the last thing that we have here is this big bolt here, and as you can see, I'm glad that I was having some problems because I forgot to push down the tabs on that flywheel bolt. But this comes off. This is pretty hard to get off. The easiest way I have found is by simply getting you a big breaker bar, and you're gonna have to wedge something in here to keep the flywheel from moving. In my case, I generally use a punch, put it in one of the teeth of the flywheel, and that will keep this whole thing from spinning. You can also have someone in the car, and they can be in here while you are tightening this down or loosening it up. This can be a little bit of a difficult part in the job here. And just so you guys know, this is a 1.5 inch socket. I mean, it's pretty big, as you can see. So that might not be something that you have in your toolkit, you know, off the bat. So this should spin out pretty easily. And in my case, it's coming off really easily. This is because the motor was obviously just apart. This is not something that I really wanted to do on this car. So that came off nice and easy. Set that off to the side. And generally speaking, you don't want to drop it, but it's not really that big a deal. Now this is a very special piece. It's a like flywheel key. You do not want to lose this. If you do lose this, you will need to get a new one. As with all the parts that I'm showing you here, 7 Mini Parts does carry this stuff. So if you need to get a replacement, they've got it. Now let's get this hosing out of the way. And at this point, you need a flywheel puller. There's no way around this last part. You absolutely need a flywheel puller in order to get this off. So let me get that out of its box and I'll show you guys what it looks like. Now the way that this flywheel puller works is actually pretty simple. You put this end on here and you have a big bolt that goes through the center here. Go ahead and run that down a little bit. So you have this big bolt. This big bolt is actually going to do kind of the primary brunt of the work while you're doing this. And then you have a smaller little keyway here. This sits down into the flywheel. This is what holds that bolt in place and prevents you from damaging the threads on this bolt hole right here. And then you have 3 bolts that pass through the sides of your flywheel puller here, and these go straight into the holes that are presented on your flywheel here. There are 3 specific holes around the sides of your flywheel here. So let me run this in. I don't know if there's a really good way for me to show this to you, unfortunately, because this is kind of a weird, it's not something that's easy to show when it's in the car like this. All right, so this next part is kind of hard. It just takes a little bit of time, especially if this flywheel hasn't been off in a long time. In my case, it should come off pretty easily because the flywheel has been off within the last, month. But the way that this works is you have 3 bolts, all needing to be at exactly the same distance away from the flywheel. That will make sure that this plate here sits perfectly even and creates an even pulling as it pulls that flywheel off. And then this bolt does the job of applying the pressure to this flywheel so it'll actually come off. Now, don't forget your little spacer down at the bottom there. And the way that I do this is I just grab an adjustable wrench and I will slowly torque this down. Sometimes when this flywheel comes off, it comes off with like a really loud pop. So just something to warn you about because it might be kind of loud, but if you're lucky, it should come off pretty simply. Now, one other thing you might encounter is the fact that your flywheel likes to spin. I forgot about that. I forgot to mention that. This is common. You just need to do the same thing you did to loosen that bolt, is put a punch inside and wedge the teeth of your flywheel so that it does not spin. All right, so in my case, that came off pretty easily because it's been off recently. That is pretty much it. So now once it's loose, this is actually usually pretty easy to do by hand. It might not be for you. It just kind of depends. And so then at this point, we can actually get the flywheel off. So you'll see this is your flywheel. And then on the other side, it has your pressure plate. So let's pull this out. And then after that comes the clutch itself, which honestly, it really does not look that bad. The fact that it was slipping so much really concerns me, but pull that out and out of the way. And then last will come your pressure plate, and that's this right here. And the pressure plate has a wear surface here and then 3 posts right there. So let's go ahead and set that off to the side too. All right, so now that we have that clutch plate out and we're back in the shop, I want to show you guys what 7 Mini Parts actually put together for me here. They did a few things for me. One is when I removed my flywheel assembly here, as you can see, this is the flywheel, and then inside is the pressure plate. Now, when those were removed, I talked with 7 Mini Parts and kind of brainstormed with them why it might not be working. We got down to the nitty-gritty, so to speak, and figured out what was going on with this whole system here. Why was it not working properly? And then effectively what we ran into, what we decided is that the flywheel and the pressure plate was out of clearance. Now, there's a special clearance that needs to be observed for this flywheel. And what I'm talking about here is the clearance of the top of one of these towers down to the friction surface on the pressure plate. So if that's too wide, your clutch is not really going to work properly. So the clutch is obviously spinning inside here, and your pressure plate sits like this, right down on top, so your clutch can spin inside. But if the clearance is off, it's never going to fully engage the clutch and you're going to lose power. Your clutch is going to slip effectively. So I sent this off to the 7 machine shop, and you'll actually see it popping up in the corner here. They actually will machine and clearance these 2 parts for you to make sure that it works properly in your car. Now, additionally, they took off my old ring gear, and my old ring gear had a lot of wear in the teeth. This is the ring gear. What this is for, it actually has your starter up against it, a spinning piece of your starter, and when you start your car, the starter actually spins and spins the ring gear, which effectively is going to spin the crankshaft and the flywheel and all of that assembly, and it's what helps get your engine started. So what they did for me is, as you can see, they cut this apart so that they could get it off, and then they put a new ring gear on. And I'm not fully aware of what that process is like. I think they have to sweat this on, but there is imagery up in the corner. This is actually my flywheel at 7 Mini Parts, and I am like totally blown away by the quality of this work. I knew those guys were good over there, but I just love getting stuff from them because it just reaffirms why I always bring my stuff to 7 Mini Parts. Anyways, if it's something that you need on your car, they do have a machine shop there, and they do a lot of different kinds of machine work. This is just one of the many things that they do. And as you can see, they completely reconditioned my flywheel, so this thing is ready to go back in the car. This is a stock flywheel. There are lightened ones, but with my setup, my final drive gear and everything, I'm gonna stay with stock. It makes the most sense in this scenario. Now, one thing is when you get something machined like this, the machine shop, in this case 7 Mini, will apply an oil to this so that it doesn't corrode. It looks very pretty, obviously, but it keeps it, it preserves it until it's time for it to go in the car. So I need to clean all of the oil, all of the grease off of this so that this friction surface is actually, you know, frictiony, and the new clutch disc will sit down on there and work properly. So I'm gonna clean these up, and then I'm gonna head back out to the car, and let's put this stuff back on the car. All right, so now we're back out at the car and it's time to start putting things back together. And there isn't a whole lot of science around this, this part. I mean, you basically reverse the steps that you took to take everything out. So if you're working on a Pre-Verto system like I am, it goes pressure plate first. So it's gonna go pressure plate first, followed by the clutch disc, and your splines, the longer end is gonna face inwards towards the motor. And then your flywheel goes over that, followed by the diaphragm and straps. I'm going to do my best to show you guys how all of this goes back together. Although if you want a really in-depth look at how this all connects up, check out the video that's popping up in the corner. That's the engine build portion of Bad Wolf Mini here, and it shows you a little bit more detailed. I just can't get the camera down into this tight spot. It's really difficult. Now, like I said, when you're putting this clutch disc in, you don't want to get any sort of oil or debris on this. This is something that needs to remain clean. Also, this longer end of the clutch disc, the side that's bigger, goes in towards the motor. Your clutch kit will come with a little bit of grease to put on these splines. That's something worth doing. It helps kind of cut down the noise and make everything kind of just jive more appropriately. All right, and next up you have your flywheel. This needs to have this opening, this little like crack across it here, this opening lined up with what's on the crankshaft. It's gonna help you immensely when you put this in and you add that key onto this here shortly. Now, next up, we are gonna be installing the flywheel bolt, washer, and the key. This key gets lined up with the flywheel and the crankshaft so that it sits on there right. And then next up, you have your washer and then your bolt. It's extremely important that this bolt gets torqued down to the right spec. If it doesn't, pretty catastrophic issues can pop up. So once we get to torquing this down, I'll go over how to do that and the specific spec. But for right now, what we want to do is just pull the flywheel in towards the motor using this bolt. And you can do that with a long breaker bar or your torque wrench to at least get it started. So make sure your openings on the flywheel are lined up. And then you're going to put this key in so that these little tabs here sit down and line everything up. All right, and now when you have that super awkward job done of tightening that down, all you need to do now is take out your little stopper so that can spin around now. The flywheel can spin, and you're gonna wanna knock down the tabs on this washer here, and that'll help lock that into place, so to speak. All right, so the next part is putting your clutch diaphragm back on the car here. Now, this part can be a little bit confusing, so what I'm going to do is kind of show you guys how all this connects up. First things first is you will need 6 clutch straps, and these are your clutch straps. I talked about them a little bit before at the beginning, and what these will do is go underneath the clutch diaphragm, and they will point offset like this all the way around your clutch diaphragm. Now there are 2 bolts. There are longer ones and shorter ones. The longer bolts will go in this hole right here, and you can also add a small washer right on this side here of the clutch diaphragm, and then these mount onto your pressure plate. That's the piece that is on the back side of your flywheel, and that's what's sandwiching the clutch plate in. Now on this side, you'll have your shorter bolt and some washers and lock tabs. So you'll have a lock tab that goes on the top here. I don't have the lock tabs right now, but I want to go ahead and show you guys this. This will go in, and then you have a washer on the other side, and that goes there. And then all this gets sandwiched down and tightened and bolted into the flywheel itself. Now, it all looks pretty straightforward, but all the diagrams and everything can be a little bit confusing. So I hope that helped kind of outline this and show how all this works. But now that you have those, the next step is to get everything tightened down. Now, in my case, it's gonna be really difficult for me to show you guys me tightening this down. It's just in a really awkward small space, but cue the time lapse of installing this diaphragm. All right, and then the last kind of major thing we have to do is put our clutch cover back on. Obviously, we're gonna adjust the plunger and everything once we're done here. But all we have to do is take our clutch cover, put it back down and on our transfer case, put all the bolts back in. There's one bolt that you're not going to be able to get to. It's going to be the one that's like right next to your subframe. If you can get that one in, awesome. In my case, I leave it out because it's such a pain in the butt to get in and out if I ever have to get in here again. But I'll leave that up to you guys, whether or not you want to try and get yours in. And then these two bolts are your engine mount, and this needs to be mounted through the subframe at the bottom. So with a little bit of magic, let's go ahead and put this on. And there we have it. We have a reinstalled cover. Next up is connecting up some of the extra stuff here. So first off, let's go ahead and address the plunger here. Now, in my case, it can move out still a little bit more, but it can't move in anymore. I can feel it making contact with the diaphragm, which is great. And then this little post right here needs a nut on it. That way you can adjust it and tighten it down and set it to spec, which I'll talk about here in a minute. But for right now, let's go ahead and get our release arm as well as reinstall the slave cylinder right here. Next, we'll go ahead and slide this pin in. Don't forget, you will need a cotter pin to go through this pin down here for your pivot point. But it's as simple as, well, one, making sure that this is in your slave cylinder, and then two, sliding it down into that plunger. All right, so the next part is about adjusting the return stop. Now there's two stops. There's a throw out stop, which is this big bolt here, and then there's your return stop, which is this bolt here. Now, this return stop is adjusted over time as the clutch disc starts to wear, but since we put a brand new clutch in, we're going to need to readjust this. And the way that it's adjusted is by taking this arm right here. As you can see, there's a bunch of free play in it, and that's normal, don't worry. But what we're going to be doing is taking out the free play in this. And to do that, we'll push this arm right here as far this direction as we can, and then what we're going to do is loosen that screw in that hole there until we get 0.02 inches of clearance in between the screw and the return arm. And with that, we have the desired amount of gap on that adjustment screw. And all we have to do now is tighten this lock nut at the bottom to make it stay in place. This lock nut right here. And once we do that, we will be able to adjust this throwout nut as well. All right, and there we go. Once you have that tightened, just go ahead and give it one more check. And in my case, it's still perfect clearance. So now we can return the spring, the return spring, to the slave cylinder arm system. And to do that, it's pretty straightforward. You just hook it onto the small loop on the back of the slave cylinder, and then you hook it through this attachment point at the front. Now the last thing that we're going to adjust here is the throwout stop, and this throwout stop in some cars doesn't even run. Some people just remove this nut. It's really there for a safety, and in fact some cars didn't even come with it in the first place. But the way that this works, the way it's adjusted, is by having someone help you. They need to press on the clutch pedal, and when they press on it, this will get pushed out, and this throwout nut will come into contact with the base of your cover here. And when it comes into contact, or if it doesn't come into contact, you need to tighten this bigger nut down until it just makes contact with the cover. And then you have your assistant release the clutch, and then you'll loosen it one stop out from there. So for right now, I'm just going to leave mine pretty loose, just so that I know my clutch will continue to work. And then once my wife gets back from out of town, I'll have her help me out with this. If you have any questions about how that works, so post them in the comment section. I'm happy to help you out. All right, and so with that, your clutch is reassembled. You just need to put your starter back in, and then bleed your system if you ended up having to disconnect it in a way that would require a bleed. Maybe you needed to replace this line. Otherwise, you're ready to roll. All right, everybody, and that's how you replace your clutch. I hope that this was complete and you guys felt like you have a good understanding and know how to do this on your car, or at least feel comfortable enough to tackle it on your own. If you have any questions, post them in the comment section below. Two things before I go. First up, I have completely reworked the tiers on my Patreon. There is a lot of new free stuff that you get if you sign up to become a patron. So if you like the stuff that I do on this channel, there are tiers all the way from $1 all the way up to $50, and every little bit goes right back into the channel. It pays for filming equipment, parts for the car, and stuff so I can continue to make these videos for you guys. In some of the tiers now, there is free access to a Discord channel, which will allow you to ask me questions directly, and I can help you guys with any problems you might have. Also, there's free mugs, there's free stickers, there's all sorts of really cool stuff. Also, you can get your name in the credits as a supporter here on the channel. So if that's something you're interested in, head to the link in the description. It's just patreon.com/classic mini DIY. Second thing is a huge shout out to 7 Mini Parts. They have been my longtime sponsor on this channel, as you guys probably already know if you've seen an episode before, but they really went above and beyond on this episode. They sent me a few different clutches to share with you guys. They also shared with me that they have a machine shop that resurfaced my flywheel and pressure plate so that I could use my original stock flywheel and pressure plate and keep things stock in the car where it's possible. So if you have any machine shop needs or parts needs, or you want any of the parts that I used in this episode, head to the links in the description. Those links show 7 Mini Parts that I am driving traffic to their site and people are buying their stuff. And I also get small kickbacks, and those go straight back into the channel. Fully transparent with you guys. That is where that money is going. It costs you no extra, but it really helps me out and helps 7 Mini Parts out by supporting their company. Now, that's it for this episode of Classic Mini DIY. The next episode might be a little odd jobs video. I've got a few random things that I want to tackle in the car, and then getting things more buttoned up and cleaned up and tidied up because the car is pretty close to done. Hoping that nothing really bad comes along. Knock on wood, but until the next video, enjoy those minis and motor on.